Mark said to make you cry, so buckle up. Hello, my name is Rebekah McCullough, and I am a mental health therapist here in the Yakima Valley. I have a practice in Sela where I see a lot of adults. I do a lot of trauma therapy. Prior to that, I was a child and family therapist in community health, and I saw a lot of kids who were being referred to services with me because they had behavior problems, ADHD, depression, anxiety, OCD behaviors, suicidal thoughts, disordered eating, things like that. And the vast majority of those kiddos also had childhood trauma that hadn't been treated yet. And even more than that, their parents did as well. And so it was there that I really started to develop a heart and a passion to treat trauma. And I knew I wanted that to be the focus of my practice. Before I dive into this, I just want to say that if you're here, then either you have been impacted by trauma or you know somebody who has, and that takes a lot of courage and vulnerability to show up in these spaces and talk about really hard things. I know for myself, I myself have experienced trauma, and it is hard. I mean, I think the instinct is to run away, not to go towards it, not to seek help and to be seen. And so it's really incredible that you're here. So yesterday, Mark did this really great thing where he made everybody take deep breaths, and so I'm gonna take a cue from him before I make you cry. So I just want everyone to take a deep breath with me, for myself too. And I want you to just relax your shoulders, either roll them back and down if you're holding tension there. If your hands are clenched, I want you to unclench them and hold them open. Just in your lap is fine. If your jaw is clenched, go ahead and relax that. If your tongue is stuck to the roof of your mouth, go ahead and release it. That's one of the ways we know we're clenched up here, right? If your forehead is tight, go ahead and release that. Okay, and then we can get started. So I will be talking today about childhood trauma and complex PTSD, and how layered trauma or trauma that happens in childhood definitely has impacts. And I'm also navigating PowerPoint. Here we go. And how childhood trauma impacts adulthood. And so before I get into that, I think it's important to talk about what trauma is. And so trauma is when a child experiences something that is extremely stressful or frightening, and is difficult to cope with and is outside of their control. This is true for adult trauma too, but specific to childhood, when we're kids, we don't have as much power and control as the adults who take care of us do, right? So between the ages of 0 to 10, we all went through this developmental stage where we were egocentric, which means we saw the world in light of ourselves. That doesn't mean we were conceited little jerks. It just means that we thought we had way more impact than maybe we did. I remember my daughter, we would drive from West Valley to Zillow where we live, and she would say, "The moon followed me all the way home." So she sees the happenings of this universe as being personal to her. So I can take a little kid who's in this egocentric stage, and I can put him in a home where mostly their physical needs are being met, mostly their emotional needs are being met, where they mostly feel safe and like they can be themselves. And that kid is likely to establish a core belief that says, I think I make good things happen. Or at the very least, I don't make bad things happen, right? I can take that same little kid and put them in a home where there's violence, maybe directly to them or around them. Or maybe there's not violence, maybe there's just chaos. That feeling of walking on eggshells, of thinking the next bad thing is going to happen. And that kid is likely to establish a core belief that says, I make bad things happen. And let's say this kid grows up and their brain develops and they realize, I don't make bad things happen. I didn't make this person hurt me or hurt my mom or hurt my dad. I didn't cause my parents' divorce. But the really sticky part is, but I think there's something intrinsically wrong with me. And that shows up in really tricky ways, right? So you miss a flight, your partner breaks up with you, The food is taking way too long to come out. It could be something that seems so silly. And the automatic thought is, of course that would happen to me. And that's a shame-based belief. That is, I'm the common denominator in bad things. So of course that would happen to me. So what we're seeing is that childhood trauma impacts how I see the world, how I see other people, and how I see myself. I think it's also important to differentiate between what we consider big T trauma and complex trauma. So big T trauma is the trauma that I think many people think of when they think of a traumatic event, right? It's this very atomic type of trauma, this lightning bolt sort of situation, right? So this would be things like an instance of abuse, a traumatic death of a loved one, an accident, a natural disaster. With big T trauma, a lot of times there's a sense of before and after, right? So there's the life I was living before I got struck by lightning, and here's the life I have now. And it can be very disorienting and horrific, and I think a lot of times people are like, I can never be who I was again. I know I've been in that place. But also there is some idea of who I was before, and some idea maybe of like what I kind of want to reclaim from that old life and bring into this after part. With complex trauma, this is trauma layered on trauma layered on trauma. So moment to moment, day to day, this would be ongoing abuse, neglect, conflict, and stressors. Again, we're talking about a little kid who doesn't have the power and control to make the bad things stop, right? In that kind of trauma, when it happens in childhood, a lot of people don't have a before and after. They just have the hope of an after. There was no before for them. This was their childhood, right? Again, I'm just differentiating between these two things. There's not one that's worse than the other. There's no, as one of my clients says, there's no such thing as a trauma Olympics. You don't win. Both have a profound impact, but they're different and they need to be differentiated, because if we're gonna provide effective interventions, then we have to look at what we're treating. Okay. All right. So transitions are sticky for me because I'm not a public speaker. Here we go. So I want to talk about the ACEs study. This is basically a huge study that was done in the late 1990s that wanted to find out if there was a correlation between childhood trauma and negative health outcomes in adulthood. And so in the CDC and Kaiser Permanente took over 17,000 participants, and they basically asked them to tally off or mark from a list of adverse childhood experiences which ones pertain to them. And for every one that you mark off, you get a score of 1. So you could potentially have a score from 0 to 10. And these were some of the things that they looked at. So under the category of abuse, they looked at physical abuse. This is what we would consider, right? This is kind of an atomic trauma. So this would be the intentional physical harm of a kid, punching, kicking, burning, biting, slapping, hitting somebody with objects, things like that. And then we have sexual abuse, which is, again, inappropriate touching, forcing a child into sexual acts, so sexual assault. Another thing when I'm asking about sexual trauma that I'll ask about is whether or not a kid was forced to look at sexualized material or pornography to engage with that, because we know that kids who are exposed to sexual material at a very young age, it impacts their brain development and their sexual development and is directly correlated with sexualized behaviors. All right, and then we have emotional abuse, which is actually the most common form of abuse. Again, this is one of those really insidious things because it's less, it can seem less obvious. Emotional abuse involves deliberately trying to scare, humiliate, isolate, ignore a child, basically making a child feel worthless or unlovable, and just like rejected. And then this would also include things like, did I say verbal abuse and psychological abuse? And then we have, under the category of neglect, we have physical neglect, which is failing to provide a kid's basic needs of food, shelter, clothing. This could also be like medical neglect. You know, a kid has a medical ailment that they need attention for, and a parent failing or refusing to get that treated. This can happen because of circumstance, so extreme poverty, but it also can be done as a form of punishment, of withholding these things from a kid. And then we have emotional neglect, which is the failure to attend to a child's emotional needs. So examples of this would be just being emotionally absent, so not being attuned to a kid's needs. And again, this is a pattern. This isn't like you had a bad day, you should have checked in on your kid, but you didn't have the bandwidth. We're talking a pattern of this. So a kid who consistently doesn't have an adult who's attuned to their emotional needs. If you're scared, did you get comforted? If you were sad, did you get comforted? If you were angry, was there loving discipline? I mean, if you had an anger outburst, right? Was there loving discipline and things like that? This is not saying anything positive to a kid, or not showing any emotional reactions to them. Another form of emotional abuse that comes up a lot in trauma therapy is when a kid is abused and it's discovered or it's disclosed to an adult. And then the adult might, one, minimize the instance of abuse. I've had clients tell me, we just acted like it never happened, or we just never talked about it again, or I knew that they knew, but they didn't do anything about it. The other thing is sometimes they're believed, right? But then nothing really happens. The people who are able to get this kid to safety, to get the kid resources so they can process the trauma, don't do that. And the example I kind of give here is if I'm on fire and you see me and you're like, dang, that looks hot. I can see that you're burning up here. That seems terrible. Burns are the worst, right? Yeah, you're validating my experience, but if you have the power to put the fire out and you don't, that is absolutely going to have an impact on how I feel about myself. It's answering that question, am I worth it? I know you love me, but dang, am I worth it? Okay. The other things that they looked at were household challenges. Mental illness, did a parent struggle with mental illness? This is more did a parent struggle with mental illness and was it managed effectively or not? Was the parent still able to manage a household, to parent a child? And then we have domestic violence. Again, this is at the place of not just when the violence is towards us, but witnessing violence. You have a kid, again, in a place where they can't make it stop, even if they want to protect a loved one and not being able to do so, being in that place of helplessness. Divorce or separation, unfortunately, as many of us know, this can be one of the most contentious and hostile interactions and ongoing battles people can have. And then a kid, again, in the middle, this directly impacts them, but they don't have a lot of power and control or direct impact. A parent who has been incarcerated, so being separated from the family and all the issues that go with that. And then having a parent who has struggled with substance abuse. Again, we know that substance abuse, hardly ever, is an isolated issue that doesn't impact a household, and especially the most vulnerable people in the household. All right, so what did they find? Childhood trauma is not uncommon. So statistically, across the board, and this is true for other studies as well, about 1 in 3 of us have experienced at least one childhood trauma or one ACE. Now, does this mean that if you experience childhood trauma, that there's no way you can come out of that, a very functional, well-adjusted adult who has meaningful connections with other people? No, it happens, right? But usually that's because there's some kind of intervention that happens early, or there's other protective factors in there. And also the fact that some traumas don't affect people the same way, right? Even kids in the same household. And so I just wanted to make sure that I said that. But also, sadly, we do know that childhood trauma does not leave people unscathed for the most part. The more negative events, so the higher your ACEs score, the more the health risks were, or the higher your health risks were. So people who had higher ACEs struggled more with substance abuse, had higher likely of suffering from things like autoimmune disorders, heart disease, lung disease, cancer, liver disease, all of these things. But I know, and this is something that I was thinking too, is that it's too easy to say, if you've had childhood trauma, of course your chances of having a substance abuse disorder goes up. And then all the health issues that come with that. But even if we removed that variable and we looked at the people who did not have substance abuse, who had childhood trauma, and did not develop substance abuse disorders, they still had really high levels and higher levels of these chronic physical ailments that people who didn't have trauma had. Additionally, adults with the highest level of ACEs had a 20-year lower life expectancy than those without a high level. So what does this tell us? That trauma literally gets under our skin. The body really does keep the score, and it affects us at the cellular level. So in order to kind of understand why that is, we have to talk about what happens when, guys, this is where I'm so thankful you're patient with me. Okay. We have to talk about what happens to the body when we are in a state of crisis. So trauma behaviors are safety behaviors. And when I'm in the face of trauma, or when I'm in the face of danger, so my favorite example is I'm hiking and I come across a bear. This is actually a real fear of mine. But if I come across a bear in the woods, my body or my brain is going to assess the danger in a moment. This is kind of an amazing superpower that we have, right? That my amygdala, my crisis center, will assess the danger and then will put me into a mode of survival automatically. I don't get to choose which one of these, right? Because my brain has already assessed the danger. When this happens, several things happen in our bodies, right? You have your heart rate. Your heart rate goes up. You start breathing more rapidly. Your airways open up so that your blood flow can go to your hands and your feet, getting you ready to run really fast or hit really hard. And while this is happening, there's other processes in your body that are being bypassed, right? So for example, the reasoning part of your brain, your prefrontal cortex, Dr. Jantz talked about this yesterday. It's a part of our brains that aren't developed until we're in our 20s. That goes offline. I don't have a lot of blood flow because it's not relevant in that moment for me to be wondering, I wonder what kind of bears are common in this region of Washington. Who cares? We don't need that part. Our bodies are efficient. Another thing that slows down or there's not a lot of blood flow is to our digestive system, right? And so when I go into this mode, several things can happen. I can go into fight mode, which is I'm gonna fight the bear. So if my brain was like, I think we got a chance, right? Attack, fend off danger with aggression. Flight, run away from the bear. Flee, get away from danger into safety as fast as possible. Freeze, this is sort of the deer in the headlights, right? This is I'm gonna play dead. So this is where my body kind of shuts down. I get as small and as still as possible. Maybe the bear will leave me alone. Maybe I'll go unnoticed. And if there's no other option, then we go into a fawn response, which is, I'm just gonna make the bear happy. So in this example, this might be, I'm taking all the granola bars out of my pockets and throwing them at the bear and being like, maybe if I can make you happy and feed you, maybe you'll leave me alone. When I get to safety, when I am no longer in the presence of a bear, right, and this is important, and my perception is the bear cannot get to me, I kind of go back to baseline, right? So my heart rate regulates, my breathing regulates, my prefrontal cortex comes back on, I can process what just happened, I can start to be curious about bears again, my digestion turns back on, and the other thing is that I get really tired. Right? I don't know if any of you have ever had a panic attack or an anxiety attack. Afterwards, you're wiped. You just need to sleep it off a little bit, right? That's part of going to baseline. But what if the bear is not in the woods? What if I live with the bear or the bear comes home every night? Then this system is kicked on over and over and over again. And I don't really get enough time in between to rest and to process and to come back down to baseline, right? And so we can see how this would cause chronic stress on a body, especially a body that is growing and especially on a brain that's still developing. And this is what we talk about, sort of getting stuck in survival mode or being living in a state of hypervigilance. All right, so what does this look like? First of all, I want to reiterate again that trauma behaviors are safety behaviors, okay? So if I'm living on edge, I am always prepared to confront the bear. If I'm stuck in fight, this might be I get triggered and I have an anger outburst, right? I'm responding to a level 3 situation with a level 9, 10 response. I can also start to get really controlling. I think a lot of us believe like the more control I have, the safer I am. I can become the instigator and again, just exhibit this really explosive behavior. If I'm stuck in flight mode, flight is like this, like you're a busybody, right? You're always in the action of trying to get to safety. So this is a kid who is the overachiever. They do everything you ask them to do. They're achieving in school and in sports and all these things. The workaholic, overthinking, going over things over and over again. Anxiety, panic, OCD, difficulty sitting still, the perfectionist, right? Buying into this formula, like if I do things just so, then I can be safe, then I'll be safe. Being stuck in freeze is when you're in a freeze response if you're having a really hard time with like thinking clearly, articulating what's going on, processing information, isolating, dissociation. This is when you're here, but you're not here, right? That like, I kind of feel like I'm watching my life from above. I don't really feel like I'm engaging. And then numbing out. If I'm stuck in the fawn response, then that's chronic people pleasing, lack of identity, which I think lack of identity comes in with all of these, but it's the idea that I'll be whoever you want me to be, just don't hurt me. I'll be whoever you want me to be, just don't leave me, right? And especially for kids, that's safety. Don't leave me, don't hurt me, choose me, okay? Being overwhelmed, if I'm concerned with everybody else's needs and I have to meet them, that's too much. Living in a state of overwhelm, codependence, and just not having needs. All right, so what are the ongoing challenges of being in survival mode? It's hard. Again, in a state of hypervigilance, you're looking for and assuming danger and hostility, which means you're going to have not only difficulty concentrating, but you're going to have a hard time reading social cues, right? Just somebody like doing that long sigh, like, or a change in expression, or someone crossing their arms, you're not assuming anything neutral about that. You're saying, what does it have to do with me? They're mad at me. Are they about to have an outburst, right? I'm constantly wondering what this has to do with me and not in a good way. In a state of hypervigilance, we are also highly critical of others and ourselves. So again, we go back to those core beliefs, right? If I believe that there's something intrinsically wrong with me, that's gonna fuel self-hate and self-loathing, right? But then at the same time, if the very people who were supposed to keep me safe and love me and choose me when I was a kid and they didn't, how am I gonna believe that people who just decide to be in my life are gonna do that? And that's a really hard place to navigate life from, right? Not being able to trust myself or accept love from others because maybe I don't feel like I'm deserving or worth it. But at the same time, how can I trust that others won't hurt me? And then struggling to live according to our values. So again, in survival mode, the singular goal is survival. Like, I just have to be safe. But when we're living according to our values, our goal is to have quality of life, right? And I have quality of life when I'm doing things that are important to me, when I'm living my life out of my identity, which is who I want to be, and things like that. You guys are doing great. Are we okay? Okay. All right. We're going to talk about the Hulk. I bet you didn't see that one coming. This is where I make you cry. Not really. So I did not come up with this. Marvel did, obviously, but also using the Hulk to explain trauma. Dr. Jacob Hom, if you're curious about complex PTSD, he's a clinician who treats it and researches it. But he's the one who kind of used the Hulk as an example. So as the story goes, the Hulk was Bruce Banner, grew up in a home where his dad was an alcoholic and very physically abusive. And Hulk's mom was his protector. And one night, in a fit of rage, his dad kills his mother in front of him. And so if you've been paying attention, Bruce Banner has several aces. So we already know that health outcomes for him is not looking good. And then as most kids do who have experienced complex trauma, he develops this self-protective rage, right? He goes into survival mode, and he's only concerned with protecting himself. And then unfortunately for him, he also gets hit with gamma rays, which turns his self-protective rage into an actual destructive superpower. And the idea is that, and if you're familiar with the Hulk, when Bruce Banner starts to feel the Hulk coming out, right, he is literally telling everybody around him to get away from him. He knows he's going to the point of no return. So he's telling the people that he loves, you got to get away from me, get out of here, right? As his rage increases, his IQ drops. Hulk smash, that's all you're getting out of him, right? He can't speak, he can't think, and most importantly, he loses all self-awareness. He's not in touch with who he really is anymore, because now he's just in a destruction mode, right, for self-protection. Yes, when he turns into the Hulk, does he destroy the bad guys? Yeah, but also he destroys New York City in every single movie, right? And then he literally has to go to a cave and sleep. And then he wakes up as Bruce Banner, and then he has to go do a bunch of damage control, because he didn't just get the bad guys, but he also destroyed a city, right? And so the idea is here that maybe for I'm just gonna say the general, maybe for those of us who have trauma, maybe it's not rage that comes out every time. Maybe it's, some of those other responses, chronic people pleasing, or perfectionism, or being a workaholic, or dissociating, numbing, isolating, right? And I can't tell you how many of my clients have so much shame about this part of them, right? They're just why do I do that? And they hate it. And when they feel it rising, there's this panic of no, stop, don't, right? They want it to go away. They don't want it to emerge. They forget that at one point, these superpowers literally kept them safe in an entire season of childhood, right? And now it's just loathing. And so Dr. Jacob Hom, this is where he comes in, right? He talks about what if how we related to the part of us that's the Hulk, what if we changed that, okay? And instead of hating it and wishing it would go away and demanding that it stop, what if we looked at the part of us that's Hulk, right, with curiosity and even gratitude? And so what if when I feel the Hulk rising in me, I say hey Hulk, no danger here. We just missed a flight. No one's gonna get hurt. It's okay. No danger here. My kid's just throwing a tantrum in Safeway. This is really stressful, but we're good. You don't need to destroy anything, right? And the goal isn't that Hulk never comes out, because if I'm ever walking in the woods and I come across a bear, I want Hulk to come out, right? But what if we could stretch the moment between being triggered in Costco, missing a flight, whatever it is, and when I respond? And that's where the work is, right? That's where I become more in charge. And again, tapping into that gratitude of man, thank you so much for showing up for me, for trying to protect me. But let's reality check the situation. All right. Thanks. I didn't ask her to say that, but I really appreciate it. You're gonna make me cry. All right. So the road to healing. What do we do with all this information? I feel this could really be a downer if we just left it there. with the ACEs study, what we know is that early intervention works, right? If you have a kid who is going into their child checkup or whatever it is and has having stomach aches and headaches, and their primary care physician screens them for trauma and they have trauma on board, then we can get them to mental health services. We can educate parents on how to validate them and how to show up for them and support them in that. Even if you didn't have those interventions when you were a kid, like there's no such thing as so far gone, right? We know that interventions in adulthood work. And so before I get to that, and one of the things I want to say is that maybe today, maybe you being here is that very first step, just acknowledging the origin story of your safety behaviors. Maybe because you know this, you can go and validate someone else's origin story, right? We have to call trauma what it is. We have to call it by name so that we can treat it. I say this all the time to my clients. You get to be messed up about messed up things. What a healthy response to trauma to be outraged and disgusted and terrified and confused, right? I don't want to shut that down. That's a healthy, valid response to terrible things. But we don't want to get stuck there, right? And it's never an excuse to do terrible things. So even though you did not tie the knots in your childhood, it is your responsibility to untangle them, especially as an adult. No one else can do trauma work for you. No one can repair a relationship for you. You have to do the work. And so how do we do that? A holistic approach. So holistic just means a whole person approach, right? So obviously, I really buy into mental health and trauma therapy, so we can start there. But also relational work. Relational work is where we start to, we talked about like reading social cues. It's where we start to practice like, what do I do when I assume the worst of somebody? What do I do when I'm assuming hostility in someone's expression? It's practicing being in safe relationship. Reparenting. Reparenting just means that as an adult, you meet the physical and emotional needs, especially the ones that you didn't get met as a child, right? So this would be, focusing on self-discipline, embracing joy, prioritizing joy in the things that make you happy, working on your own emotional regulation. Again, you're the only one who can do it. We can't expect other people to just never trigger us. That's not the answer. If I have a trigger, it is my responsibility to dismantle my trigger, right? It's like a landmine. I'm the only one who can dismantle it. And then self-care, making sure we're taking care of ourselves. Physical health, beyond obviously medication, if you have physical ailments, go to your doctor, get them treated. But also focusing on mind-body connection. When we're stuck in survival mode, we literally don't feel safe in our own bodies, right? We gotta find ways to feel safe in our bodies again. This can be through yoga, through some sort of exercise or mindful movement, even looking for like trauma-informed massage, things like that. Learning how to nourish ourselves. Again, this all just goes back, right, to just taking care of yourself and making sure these needs are met. And so you guys did it. We did it. That's it for me. But I'm just so thankful. I'm so humbled that I get to be part of this. And I really hope that if even just one person here feels validated, feels seen, again, remember we talk about it is traumatic to not be seen and to not be known. And so if you feel that, or if you feel equipped to go and validate somebody in their trauma story, then I think this was a huge success. So thank you so much.